Hello everyone, let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about the spinal cord and spinal nerves. Remember, the human nervous system can be broken down into two fundamental parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Inside the central nervous system, the spinal cord is providing three critical functions. The first job that it does is simply conducting nerve impulses. The spinal cord is involved in conducting nerve impulses from the central system out into the peripheral, and also from the peripheral system up into the central. The second function that the spinal cord provides is integration of nervous impulses. It's receiving a lot of afferent sensory input from the peripheral nervous system, and so it has to integrate that information before that information gets reacted to or even sent up to the brain. Third on the list of functions is initiation of a response. If you recall from the stimulus response pathway that we discussed, the job of the central nervous system is to not only integrate this incoming sensory information, but to make a response. So the spinal cord is involved in directing that response out into the peripheral system along efferent motor pathways. Now, there are two ways that the spinal cord does this. One of the ways is independent of the brain for the most part. We've talked about this before. These are what we call reflexes. It's possible for sensory input to come into the spinal cord, be integrated in the spinal cord, and then a response be initiated from the spinal cord without input from the brain. This is what's called a neural reflex. These are involuntary responses. They're what we call stereotypical. In other words, they are repeatable. They happen the same way again and again and again. Neural reflexes that are initiated by the spinal cord are very fast. They require no conscious thought or decision. They can be quite protective. They can help protect against injury, and they help maintain homeostasis. But it's important to know that while neural reflexes can happen independently of the brain, it's also possible for the brain to influence them. Think about the last time that you went to the doctor for a checkup. If it was a routine physical, the doctor may have taken out one of those little metal hammers that has a rubber tip on the end, and the doctor may have tested your patellar reflex. The physician takes that little hammer and gently taps on your patellar tendon, the tendon around your kneecap. And of course, we all know that what happens is the lower part of your leg will sort of snap out and then back again. This is a reflex. It comes from the impact of the hammer with the patellar tendon. You don't have to think about extending your lower leg. It just happens. But you probably also know that if you're staring at your leg while the physician performs this maneuver, you may or may not experience that reflex. If you're thinking about it, if you're thinking about whether or not it's going to happen, or whether or not it's going to be a large movement or a small movement, you can actually interrupt the reflex by doing that, which is why a lot of physicians try to engage you in conversation and distract you a little bit while they perform that test. So, reflexes are involuntary and independent of the brain, but the brain can override them The brain can influence them. Now, the spinal cord also initiates responses to sensory input in coordination with the brain. Outside of neural reflexes, a lot of the work that the spinal cord does, integrating information and initiating a response, is done in coordination with the brain. Let's spend a few minutes now and talk about the gross anatomy of the spinal cord. The spinal cord is essentially a piece of ropey material that runs through the central canal created by the vertebral column. The spinal cord is not a solid piece of material. It's actually created from lots and lots of fibers. If you were to examine it, for example, at surgery, it's possible to sort of tease those fibers apart if you remove the protective outer coverings that are present. The spinal cord gives rise to nerves that come out essentially perpendicular to the cord. There are 31 pairs of these nerves. One comes out on the left side, one comes out on the right side for each of the spinal nerves. These spinal nerves are associated with and named for each of the 5 types of vertebrae. Remember, there are cervical vertebrae, there are thoracic vertebrae, there are lumbar, there are sacral, and there are coccygeal. We use that same terminology to describe the spinal nerves. The count between the vertebrae and the spinal nerves is close, but it's not exact. Here's the difference. While there are 7 cervical vertebrae, there are 8 cervical spinal nerves. There are some more important differences that we'll talk about in just a moment. So the spinal nerves are named for the same types of regions that the vertebrae are named for, and the spinal cord itself is also described as having those 5 regions. The cord itself has a cervical region, a thoracic, a lumbar, a sacral, and a coccygeal region. But here's what's very strange. The spinal cord in an adult human is only about 18 inches long, approximately. It's shorter than the vertebral column. You might imagine that the spinal cord runs the entire length of the vertebral column, but it does not. The spinal cord actually widens a little bit in the lumbar region of the vertebrae, and then it tapers down to a point. We give that point a name. We call it the medullary cone. That's also referred to in some source materials as the conus medullaris. Either one of those is just fine. That lumbar enlargement and then that tapering into the medullary cone, that's the end of the spinal cord. Now, what happens at the end of the spinal cord is a bundle of what we call nerve roots emerges and continues to travel down to the end of the vertebral column. These nerve roots, this bundle of nerve roots, also gets a name. It's called the cauda equina. So in the space created by the vertebral canal between approximately L2 and S5, there is no cord. There's a bundle of nerve roots, and they are called the cauda equina. So these regional terms that we use, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, coccygeal, they apply to both the cord itself and to these pairs of spinal nerves that come off of the cord. It's just that they don't entirely match up with what we think of as those regions in the vertebral column. So we need to know just a little bit about where they coordinate and where they don't. In this image, you're looking at a human being drawn from the side view. You can see the brain and this black rope that represents the spinal cord. This vertebral column has been cut in half so that we're able to visualize the spinal cord running down the canal created by the vertebrae. You can see the vertebral bodies facing in the anterior direction. You can see the spinous processes in the posterior direction, and then you can see these black lines running off laterally. These represent spinal nerves. Now remember, the spinal nerves are paired, so one comes off of each side of the cord, left and right. And you'll notice that the spinal nerves travel fairly regularly out from between the vertebrae. The strange thing is that instead of being 7 cervical spinal nerves, we see 8 cervical spinal nerves. The rest of them, though, match up with the numbered vertebrae in terms of how many there are. There are 12 paired thoracic spinal nerves. There are 5 paired lumbar spinal nerves, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. Over here on this side, you're also looking at a sketch of a human. You can see the vertebral column. You can't see the spinal cord in this drawing, but you can see these nerves emerging. Pairs of them, one on each side, all the way down. Remember, the spinal cord itself is ending in the area of L1, but these nerves are going to continue to emerge because they travel down from the end of the spinal cord in the cauda equina, and then they exit out from the vertebral column at the correct location. So cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, coccygeal, we're going to apply those terms to the vertebrae, to the spinal cord, and to the spinal nerves. We just have to remember that they don't all match up. On this slide, you're looking at, again, vertebral column. You can see the sections of each vertebrae cut in half so that we can see the cord lying in the canal. Vertebral bodies over here anteriorly, and spinous processes in the posterior direction. They've outlined for us the sections, as you travel down, the sections of the spinal cord in different colors: cervical in blue, thoracic in red, lumbar, and so on and so on. But notice that the conus medullaris occurs right around L1. So the cord itself is ending right around there. Everything that emerges after that are just individual strands that we call nerve roots. They're traveling down in this cauda equina. They will exit. They will exit the same way that all of the spinal nerves exit the vertebral canal. They will exit at the right level, according to the vertebrae, but the cord itself is ending at L1. So let's talk about how we number these spinal nerves. It's not exactly the same all the way down the vertebral column. Remember, we said there are 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves, even though there are only 7 cervical vertebrae. So the first pair of cervical spinal nerves emerges from between the skull and the first cervical vertebra, or the atlas. So that C1 spinal nerve is coming above or superior to the C1 vertebra. The rest of the cervical spinal nerves follow that pattern. they all emerge just above, just superior to the same numbered vertebra. So C2 spinal nerve emerges above or superior to the C2 vertebra. The C3 spinal nerve is superior to the C3 vertebra, and so on and so on and so on. Now, once you get below the cervical vertebrae, the cervical bones of the vertebral column, the pattern changes. This is where that extra cervical nerve comes in. From the end of the cervical vertebrae on down, the rest of the bony vertebral column, the spinal nerves are going to emerge below or inferior to the corresponding numbered vertebra. So for example, spinal nerve L3 is going to emerge inferior to vertebra L3. So the cervical ones emerge superior, the rest of them emerge inferior. Continuing on with the gross anatomy of the spinal cord, outside of the cord itself, there are layers of protective, fibrous connective tissue that help protect the spinal cord. These are very similar to the layers that surround the brain. These layers are referred to as meninges, and you've probably heard that term meninges before, but you may not have heard the names of the individual layers. So there are 3 layers, and from the outside, the outermost layer is called the dura mater. The dura mater is actually fairly loose-fitting. I've read it described as a sleeve. I like that analogy, that it's a sleeve on the very outside of the spinal cord. The arachnoid mater is just underneath the dura mater. This is actually a layer of simple squamous epithelium. It adheres to the inside of the dura mater on one side, and then on the other side, it creates this sort of a meshwork that create also a gap, a space, until it runs into the third layer, which is called the pia mater. Now this space that's created by these mesh-like projections of the arachnoid mater, we give it a name. The space itself is called the subarachnoid space. And this space is where cerebrospinal fluid flows around the cord. I'll show you a picture of this in just a minute. So the inner side of the arachnoid mater, where we find this loose meshwork of fibers, is going to then come into contact with the innermost connective tissue layer, which is called the pia mater. The pia mater is actually very delicate. This is the layer that comes in contact with the cord, and it very closely follows the contours of the cord. It's thin, it's delicate, and it's very vascular. On this slide, we're looking at an individual vertebra right here. We're looking at the spinal cord right here, at least a section of it, and we're looking at the 3 protective meningeal layers that surround it. So this is the cord right here. It's been cut. You can see that the layer of connective tissue that is right on top of it is called pia mater. Then the next layer out from that is called arachnoid mater. And then finally we have what's called dura mater. Now, a couple of things you can see here. You can see a spinal nerve emerging here. Remember, there would be a pair for that nerve on the other side that we just can't see. You'll notice that you can't see the nerve itself because it's also covered with pia mater, arachnoid mater, dura mater. That covering not only covers the cord, but it covers the spinal nerves up to the point that they leave the protection of the vertebral column. The other thing that you can note is that within the arachnoid mater, in the virtual, if you will, space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, the inner part of the arachnoid mater is not just a flat surface. It's sort of shredded. It creates a mesh of connective tissue, and that mesh has spaces within it. And those spaces are actually where cerebrospinal fluid flows up and down the length of the spinal cord inside the subarachnoid space, inside that meshwork of connective tissue fibers that lie between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. Here's another view. We're looking at a single vertebra right here in this tan color. This is the vertebral body. On this side, the spinous process would be over here. Here's the spinal cord running in the canal created by that vertebral body and spinous process. You can see that the cord is surrounded by layers of material. There are three, remember. There's the pia mater, and they're showing us that as this brown layer right here, directly on top of the spinal cord. Very thin, very delicate, very vascular. Then they're showing us the second layer, which is the arachnoid mater, shown in a more reddish color. And then there's a third layer shown in black down here, which is the dura mater. So they've cut away, they've cut both the cord, then they've cut away at a lower level the arachnoid mater, then they've cut away at a lower level the dura mater. Notice that the dura mater is probably the thickest of the layers. There is a lot of thickness to the arachnoid mater, but remember, most of that thickness is just this meshwork of fibers. They're showing us that by drawing them perpendicular to the cord. It's not solid, in other words. It's a mesh. It's an open, airy network of fibers. And inside, in between all of those fibers, is where the CSF is flowing. That's the subarachnoid space.